last week, Tom introduced us to our new series, which is got the title of Risk Takers. And it was a clear call last week to abandon ourselves to the high adventure of following God. And being people who take risks for God, being people who are willing to sacrifice all else as an act of worship to who God is and what he's done for each of us, that we would be people, because of what Jesus has done for us, that could be friends of God. And so this week we're picking up that theme in the form of three devoted members of God's family. We heard about them just a bit earlier on by the names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And not names that trip off our tongue particularly easily. And yet, strangely, and you get this very often, particularly with Old Testament passages in the Bible, it's a really popular bedtime story, this one. If you read Bible stories to your kids at night, this is one that I bet many of you have as a favourite, which is somewhat odd, to be honest. Because, as you read this story and you actually look at it in the cold light of day, we're talking about a story of mortal threat, of burning these three guys alive in a fiery furnace. You'd think that would be an odd one to read to your child just as they're about to go off to bed. But nonetheless, that's where we are. We get ahead of ourselves, though, because the scene that we're setting today, which is from a book of the Bible called Daniel, we're looking at Daniel chapter 3, begins with an opening ceremony. And it says that King Nebuchadnezzar, and he was the king of the Babylonian Empire, has made an image of gold. And he has set up an opening ceremony that's to be held on, as you can see there, the plain of Dura in Babylon. And at the center of this opening ceremony is this unveiling of a statue that he has had made. Now, we're not told whether this is a statue of himself or indeed of his God or of something else, but it's a big statue. If you've got one of those Bibles where, at either the beginning or the end, it describes to you different types of measurements. That's 6 cubits wide and 60 cubits high. I had to look up in mine. And what you find is that is something which is 90 feet tall. This is a tall statue. If that doesn't mean anything to you, 27 meters is what we're talking about here. It's a tall statue. And Nebuchadnezzar has erected this statue to himself and to the glory of his empire. That in itself is nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. Even back in ancient times, this is one of the wonders of the world. If you just look at this thing here, I don't know if you can see this chap here. This is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, Colossus of Rhodes. And 300 years or so before Jesus, this statue was erected to meet sailors as they sailed into the wonderful port of Rhodes, as to give glory both to that city and to their god, the god of Helios, god of sun. And so Nebuchadnezzar has a statue erected in a very public space, this place called the Plain of Dura. If that means nothing to you, you might think of a public space that we have in the UK. Think of London. Think of Trafalgar Square. Yeah, a very public area with a very prominent statue in it, in the form of Nelson's column. Now, I Googled this last night because I'm sad like that. Nelson's column's taller than the one we're talking about today. That's 169 feet and 3 inches. I don't know who got that 3 inches there, but who's counting? This is a tall statue. And I don't know what your mind is drawn to as you think of this opening ceremony. I'll be honest, my mind went to this. Does anyone recognise what this is? The Olympics, 2012, the Olympic Games opening ceremony in London. And if you remember this, it was wonderful, wasn't it? My mind kind of imagines this scene of, Danny Boyle being sort of taken back in time and opening the ceremony to the unveiling of this statue. I don't know whether they had Mary Poppins coming down from the sky. It might be, in my mind's eye, you'll forgive me, in my mind's eye, King Nebuchadnezzar, with his James Bond equivalent, skydives in to the stadium and, to great applause and great aplomb. And so he unveils this fantastic statue. And what we see here is all the great and the good of the whole Babylonian Empire, the largest, most powerful empire of its day, and for many years to come, arrive and are part of this unveiling ceremony. They all turn up. And what we see there in verse 5 of Daniel chapter 3 is that all these people, as soon as they hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, now that's repeated several times in this passage, these are instruments drawn from across the empire. Yeah, so across the empire, these people come and they worship this statue, which is set up for the worship of these people to the Babylonian Empire. And what we find here is, a little bit like Seb Coe when he opened up the 2012 Olympics. He said, "Wonderful to see you." What we see here in this passage is a spokesperson who steps forward, sounding in my mind's eye a little bit like Seb Coe. And he says this, as soon as you hear these instruments play, you are to fall down and to worship this image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. This is an extremely dark version of the party game Musical Bumps. What happens here is instead of when the music stops, everyone kind of falls to the ground. What's to happen here is that when the music starts up, all these wonderful instruments, some of which we've heard of, some of which we haven't, in my case, as soon as the music starts, everyone is expected to bow their heads, to drop down, and to worship in front of this statue. And, if in my mind's eye, if Game of Thrones did party games, this would be the party game they play. Because what happens if you don't bow down before this statue? Well, this very kind, lovely spokesperson points it out to everyone, that actually if you fail to hit the floor quickly enough, then rather than being lovingly guided to the side of the room, where you sit and watch everyone else have fun in your lovely party frock, and feel a bit sorry for yourself, and perhaps you're given some sweets and some crisps to keep you going whilst everyone else has fun. That's, of course, not what happens. In fact, what you find is that you're burned alive, which isn't very kids-friendly, is it? Let's be honest. And what we see here in reality is less of a civic ceremony, and more of a worship service. As we read through Daniel chapter 3, you'll notice several things. Firstly, the name Nebuchadnezzar is mentioned quite a lot of times, 7 times. 7 might be significant to some of you. The word worship here is used, in my translation at least, 11 times in this chapter. This ceremony that's going on is described as a dedication. There's these orchestral accompaniments that come with these songs. This is a worship service. And don't miss the importance of the image that we see here. This statue. The idea of this enormous statue reminds us immediately, as we've been reading through Daniel, of what's just happened. Now, I forgive you because we've not read chapter 2. But if you've read Daniel before, you'll remember that in that chapter, King Nebuchadnezzar is asleep in his room. And he has this incredible vision, this dream of a statue. And the way that he describes this statue, he goes out and asks all the great and the good of the Babylonian Empire to interpret this dream for him. What on earth can this statue mean? And Daniel, the biblical character of Daniel, the same Daniel of the lion's den, comes and he, on behalf of God, explains to Nebuchadnezzar what this dream means. And he points out the fact that this statue that Nebuchadnezzar has dreamed of has a head of gold, which represents Nebuchadnezzar. But also the rest of the body is made up of lots of other types of materials, which depicted lesser kingdoms that would come after his, and that in time would become fragmented and be destroyed with the coming of God's kingdom. Some parts of the statue are made of clay, others of silver, etc. What was this statue in Daniel 3 made of entirely? Gold. Gold. I don't know whether it was through with gold. That would be a lot of gold, presumably, to be used. But nonetheless, Nebuchadnezzar makes himself in this chapter a statue from head to toe made of gold. What does that tell you? I think that is a massive, clear, defiant statement on behalf of this king, Nebuchadnezzar. What he is saying here is he is asserting that there would be no end to his kingdom. It's a clear, defiant statement toward the God of Israel. The other thing that jumps out here is the location of this statue. We've already mentioned it, the plain of Jura. Now, people debate this as to exactly what the location of that is. But it's really interesting that there was another tower that's spoken of in the Old Testament in Genesis chapter 11, called the Tower of Babel. And it's described there as being built on one of the plains in this very area. Whether it's the same location or not, our minds, if we're listening to it, are drawn to that tower. And if you remember, if you've read Genesis 11, you'll remember there that this Tower of Babel was seeking to draw people's attention to man's achievements. And what they were trying to do there was build a tower toward God. And somehow in the midst of all this, God steps in and brings confusion. If you remember this, God comes and he with each person that's helping to build this tower, he brings different languages so that they can't understand what one another's doing. And they speak in Babel to one another. They can't understand, and therefore they're scattered throughout the earth. God frustrates those plans because they're plans to build up man as the center of attention, rather than God. And so here, for King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, perhaps on the same site, he has built a high statue. And his attempt here to say throughout the passage that there's lots of people from lots of different parts of his empire, from this huge empire of many nations, many languages, to be brought together under one banner, the banner of Babylon, the great empire. Now back to our musical bumps. Sure enough, understanding the rules of the game, the music blares out. And it says here that they have all peoples, nations and men of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And for a moment, we see here the whole world of its day was united in bowing down to Nebuchadnezzar's statue. If you like, here, Nebuchadnezzar has broken the curse of Babel. It seemed as if he'd been successful. But while everyone else was bowing down, it was clear that a very small group of 3 people stand with unbowed heads. And these are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These young men although trained in the ways of the Babylonian Empire, people who'd taken on new names. They used to be called Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, called good Jewish names. They'd taken on these Babylonian names, were good Jews. And they knew that they had been created in the image of their Creator. They knew from Genesis 1 that they had the fingerprint of God in their lives. Anyone made in the image of God should not be bowing down to any man-made image. And so as good Jews, they stand in defiance of the tyranny of their day, of Babylon. Now, we don't know how many people were there at this opening ceremony, but I can bet that standing up in that crowd, whilst everyone else bowed, felt like a very lonely activity. Yet they chose not to hide in the crowd, but to choose to stand out. We might find ourselves asking sometimes, what difference can I make? What difference can little old me make in my workplace, in the culture that seems so against the things of God at times? These three guys stand up and they stand out. We use the phrase sometimes of swimming upstream or swimming against the tide. And the truth is, things can often be a little bit more complicated than that. I don't know if you ever find yourself caught up in either in the tide as it goes out to sea, or you found yourself in a fast-flowing stream. What you find is, very often, there are different currents going through that stream. Some of them are really good things. Some currents that we find ourselves in our culture are very positive ones. Some of them can be toward negativity. We've heard from the mayor this morning of a culture that we can be in danger of taking part in our city, that of negativity, of rather than speaking hope, speaking negativity into our city. And it can be very easy to do that. At a personal level, just in speaking with others, it's very easy to go along with the gossip. It's very easy to go along with a spirit of negativity. It can be very hard, on the other hand, to choose to stand up and to take a different spirit, to approach things in a different and more positive way. If following Jesus for you feels comfortable, you're probably not doing it right. I'll say that again. If following Jesus for you feels comfortable, you're probably not doing it right. That might sound a bit harsh, but I don't think there's ever a time when the sayings and the teachings of Jesus, of what he's called us to, shouldn't challenge us to the very core of who we are, to question our motives, to question our way of life, to question everything, and to actually live by the teaching of Jesus and follow him as a community of people is a profoundly disruptive thing. Following Jesus disrupts every part of our lives in a really good way. But it can also be challenging to do that. It's much easier to go with the flow. It's much easier to go with the flow. It takes no effort to stop and get carried along with the way everyone else is behaving, the expectations of everyone else around us. It can take immense effort to swim against the tide. Now, there's a real challenge here of knowing where at times it's right that we fight against the tide and swim in the opposite direction. And when it takes real wisdom to know when there's things around us that are of good that we should affirm and look to. But that's what we do together as his community of people. We work together. We talk about things in small group together. We talk about things with our friends and with those we do church together with, to seek wisdom to know how best to live for Jesus in our time and in our place. What we see here from these three is this: true devotion obeys God. I could just stop there, actually. True devotion obeys God. But it's regardless of the feelings that we have within us, the circumstances around us, or the consequences before us. The feelings within us, the circumstances around us, or the consequences before us. These three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, choose to stand when everyone else around them bowed. Despite what they were feeling, despite the circumstances of everyone around them and what they were choosing to do, despite the consequences of standing up, they chose to obey God and what he'd had for their lives. And so sure enough, verse 8 we see, if you're reading through, that some astrologers, some sort of Jobsworths, are looking around and they see that these three are still standing and dob them in to King Nebuchadnezzar. And at hearing this, King Nebuchadnezzar is absolutely livid at what he sees. And so summoning, the best Godfather voice he can, Nebuchadnezzar speaks to these three. And he says this, in my words, let me just explain to you the rules of musical pumps. He says this, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up? Now you hear, don't you, the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music. If you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. I'll just give you one more chance. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? I joke, but actually I think there's a lot of theatre actually in this passage. Nebuchadnezzar is livid. And so what happens next? I think this is the pivot of this passage. What is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego going to say? They say this, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. Who are you? You're just the king of the mightiest empire in the world. But who are you? We don't need to defend ourselves. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from it, Your Majesty, from Your Majesty's hand. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. And so these three, they're bound and thrown into the furnace. This furnace has been heated so hot, 7 times hotter than usual, that those four soldiers taking them in and throwing them into this furnace die themselves because of the heat. It's curious. I've always wondered why they didn't reduce the heat, because that would be longer and more painful. But anyway, that's detail. What we see here is these three are thrown. So that's where my mind goes. Sorry about that. These three are thrown into the furnace. And what we see here, I think, this is just wonderful. What is it that these three see? And what is it that they say to Nebuchadnezzar? There's three things that they say. The first thing they draw Nebuchadnezzar's attention to is God. God is able. God is able. Now, I don't know what circumstances you find yourself in. I'm not going to start guessing what your equivalent of a fiery furnace is. But I would challenge you this morning that actually when you find difficulty, as we heard from Marvin earlier on, suffering happens. It's an inevitable part of being a human being. People face difficulty. And when you face that suffering, do you believe that God is able? That he is more than capable of saving you? The second and equally important thing that these three recognize is that not only is God able, not only is he powerful, he's also willing. I think we need to pause there because these two things make all the difference. You know, what's the thing right now for you where you recognize the need to trust God? It might be a job or a relationship. It might be a sickness that you're suffering or a family member or friend is struggling with. It might be money struggles or a sense of hopelessness. Do you believe that God is able? And do you believe that God is willing to step in and to do wonderful things? If I'm completely honest, when I'm going through tough times, the question I ask is not, is God able? If I'm honest, the question I ask myself very often is God willing? And at that time, if we're not careful, we find ourselves questioning the character of God. We find ourselves questioning him. Not whether he is able, but whether he's willing. And so this morning, I don't feel qualified to give you a pat answer. I can't look at myself and say, I've got this one worked out. But what I can see here is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these three people who give a much better answer than I could. Because they cling to these two truths. God is willing and God is able. But they also go one step further. And this is the one that enables them not only to survive, but to thrive in the midst of the circumstances they find themselves in. Because they say not only is God able and he's willing, but crucially, you probably can't see that. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, you can. But even if God doesn't come through, we're going to do what God wants anyway. Even if the worst happens, I will not move from trusting in God. In the last analysis for these three characters, faith was not in their deliverance, but in their God. Their faith was not in their deliverance, but in their God. Live or die, they chose that they would be faithful to God and trust God with the consequences, trust God with the outcome. You know, they had the same kind of faith that Job had. You know, Job 13 and verse 15 says this, though he slay me, yet I will trust him. Do you remember the words of Paul in the New Testament? It says this, he said, you know, he wanted to glorify God in his body, either by life or by death. He'd choose to trust God. He put his money where his mouth is by saying, it doesn't matter what happens to me, I'm going to trust God. These three characters in our story this morning, they knew that should they die, their faithful testimony would be to display the worthiness, not of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire, but to display the worthiness of God. And if it took them dying to show that worthiness, that is what they would do. But they also know that should God deliver them, his name would be vindicated. I wonder for you what you'd be thinking as you'd be walked towards this blazing furnace. I think here what we see is that they were people who demonstrated what Brennan Manning, wonderful author Brennan Manning, if you've not read anything by Brennan Manning, type it into Google, find a book by him and read it. It's really good. It'll be good, I promise. I've read pretty much all of them, I think. He says this. He describes the kind of trust that they show here as this. Ruthless trust. Ruthless trust. Tim Keller, wonderful preacher and church leader from the United States, New York, says this. He makes the point that this passage about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is this, that actually these three learn to trust God and to worship him for who he is. Worship God for who he is. They choose to praise God for being God. Not for how he acts in these circumstances, the way I want him to act. And if he doesn't act like that, I'll throw my toys out the pram. No, for worshipping God for who he is. And that is worship. That is devotion. And so most of us, we might not face a literal furnace. But actually what we will find in our life is that just as furnaces in the Bible are often used as a metaphor for suffering in our life, we will suffer. And what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego find is that there's no A-team style rescue just as they're about to be thrown into the furnace. But what they do find is in being shoved into that furnace. Who do they find there? I don't think I've got the passage up on the screen, which is an error of mine. But as you read on in this story, what you find is Nebuchadnezzar is aghast at what he sees. Because what Nebuchadnezzar sees as he looks at this furnace is not 3 people in the furnace, but 4. Of what seems like a son of God in the furnace alongside Abednego, Shadrach, and Meshach. What these 3 find is that God was with them all along, but God was with them in the furnace, in the circumstances that they find themselves in. And so as we close, I ought to, because I'm 2 minutes over. As we close, I want to draw your attention to the difference that God makes. Look at Jesus here. Through Jesus' life and his death, he did what the Tower of Babel couldn't do, and he did what Nebuchadnezzar's idol couldn't do. Because it's around Jesus, not some stupid tower or statue, that men and women from every tribe, every nation, every language, every tongue come together across social, racial, ethnic lines as the new people of God. If you're looking for a towering symbol that binds all people together, it's not Nebuchadnezzar's statue. It's the cross. It's the cross. And so this morning you might feel that there are areas of your life that you have, if you like, gone with the flow, where you recognize what you should be doing is staying standing and not bowing, swimming against the tide rather than with it. And this morning I'd encourage you that actually that recognition in your life that you should have stood where you've chosen to go with the flow is a sign of grace in your life this morning. That points you to Jesus. And this morning, by his power, by his Holy Spirit, he can give you fresh power this morning to choose to stand up for what you believe in and for the God who loves you. And secondly, how God works in the midst of our circumstances is also this. and I think some of you need to hear this morning too, that actually you're going through a tough time. You're going through suffering and difficulty. You've got questions. You're not sure how things are going to work out. But actually what you find, just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego found, is that God is with you in the midst of those difficulties. But it's by God's grace that each of us can make that even if kind of statement, to trust ruthlessly in God, to choose to obey him no matter what it costs us, no matter where it takes us. Let's pray. Why don't you stand with me?